Kalorama, a recorded books / High Bridge imprint, presents The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie, by Major Garrett and David Becker. Read by Kent Klineman. Introduction. Americans talk a lot about civil war. Some say it is here. Some say it is coming. It's difficult for anyone to accurately predict because no one remembers how bloody, costly, and destructive our first and only civil war actually was. Yes, we are discontented people frustrated by the convulsions of a digital economy, a global pandemic, and an anguished reassessment of our racial history. Surveys show, where politics is concerned, we are prepared to assume the worst about one another. Demographic data show we are becoming more isolated and homogenized in like-minded communities. These trends have made us less tolerant, more fearful that political differences are about something deeper, our own identity and place in the American story. But civil strife is not the same as civil war. We have not dissolved the bonds of our union yet. That we toy with the idea and terminology may mean nothing or everything. We're so divided in our country more than at any point since the Civil War, historian Doris Kearns Goodwin told us. Her fears were most pronounced about elections and faith in democracy. We talked to others who have felt these anxieties and antagonisms up close. Bob Harvey is a commissioner in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a picturesque suburb northwest of Philadelphia. Among his many duties, Harvey oversees elections in Bucks County and has received numerous death threats since the 2020 election, as have dozens of his non-elected county employees. Harvey described his county's election experience in 2020 as the most contentious in 150 years. Harvey is soft-spoken, well-tailored, a Democrat, and a late-in-life convert to local government. I have spent 26 years, he says, more than half my life, teaching high school social studies, specifically American history. This is not something I've seen in the history of this country except for before the Civil War, and it does scare me. I'm really worried we're approaching a precipice that's going to be impossible to come back from. Kathy Bernier is a member of the Wisconsin legislature, a fierce Trump supporter, and among the most conservative voices in state politics. She's been working elections for nearly 40 years, starting as a poll worker in the mid-1980s in Anson, a town of about 1,500 in Chippewa County. Bernier later became county clerk and then wrote election laws in the legislature while a member of the Assembly and Senate elections committees. Bernier knows election law and politics. In late 2021, she took heavy criticism for defending the 2020 election and calling for an end to ceaseless Republican-led investigations. Bernier speaks bluntly and emphatically, her voice flat as an icy lake. I care about the Republicans in the state, but we can't continue to beat a dead horse. We need to move on. Lies are destroying America. Ricky Hatch lives in Weber County, Utah, and has been a Republican election official there since 2012. He has also testified before Congress on election security matters and served as an advisor on election security to the Department of Homeland Security. He lives and works in Ogden, and in April 2022 still heard complaints about the 2020 election, even though Weber County, like the rest of Utah, saw no allegations of election fraud or contested results. It happens all the time. The emails and the phone calls, people telling me, we have to go back to voting in person, having ID at the polls, Hatch told us. They tell me we have got to get rid of this voting by mail crap, that voting by mail is not secure, that it's fraught with fraud, and Democrats want to use it to take over the world. Hatch offers tours of the county's vote counting machinery, walks the curious through the process of checking and double-checking results. He also reminds suspicious Republicans about a 2012 statewide push for voting by mail, led by the Utah Republican Party. For some, Hatch's explanations are persuasive. For others, no amount of information or transparency will suffice. They say, I know your machines have been hacked by China. I show them there is no means to hack the machines, that nothing is connected. They just say, they have been hacked. You just don't know it. It's just crazy. I have answers. They won't believe me. Hatch has also noticed a pattern among those he is able to persuade that Weber County's systems are verifiable and secure. Voters will say they now believe in the county's methods, but not in election results and the officials who produced them in Arizona, Michigan, Georgia, Wisconsin, or other states contested in 2020. They say, I trust you, and I tell them there are 9,000 other me's, people like me, around the country, and they care as much as I do, and they are just as competent as I am. Hatch has commiserated with Republican election officials around the country who have encountered skepticism, hostility, threats, physical intimidation, and vandalism. His own car was vandalized twice, on Election Day and on the day Utah certified its electoral count. He attributes the volatile mindset to a cultish grip former President Trump wields over his supporters. I hate saying this, but he has the same characteristics as a cult leader. He pulls people into a belief system. I thought it would die down. It's getting stronger. People are more skeptical now than they were a year ago. That election denialism has grown more potent in places like Utah, where election results were never questioned, looms darkly over the nation's political landscape. At the end of the day, the character of the people we elect matters, says Representative Liz Cheney, Wyoming Republican and member of the January 6th committee. But if you have a president who's willing to go through all the guardrails of our democracy, the structure and the framework of our laws will prove insufficient. Ultimately, we had a president who, for the first time in American history, was not committed to ensuring the peaceful transfer of power and committed to supporting the Constitution in carrying out his duties, and instead did everything possible to overturn the results of the election and to stay in power. In this book, you will hear from these voices and from many others we interviewed, election professionals, poll workers, and secretaries of state, who live on the suddenly unsettled, sometimes dangerous front lines of American democracy. Our conversations and deep experience with politics and election law have made us wonder if we are using the proper terminology to describe our current crisis. Are we divided or divisible? Divided to us sounds permanent. Divisible is voluntary and can certainly be temporary. Divisible is also an antonym of the word our Pledge of Allegiance, adopted after the Civil War, says we are indivisible. It seems we are choosing to be more antagonistic to one another, as if Divisibility is a game, a diversion, a self-erasing Snapchat. We argue it is not. We fear America is heading heedlessly into dangerous psychological territory. Our aggressions, our divisions, and even our fears impel us to imagine the previously unimaginable. This, many have said, was the experience before and during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. As Finian O'Toole, a writer for the Irish Times who grew up in Dublin, wrote in The Atlantic in early 2022, the belief there was going to be a civil war in Ireland made everything worse. Once that idea takes hold, it has a force of its own. When aggressions, divisions, and fears burrow deeply enough, they can become inevitable to a person, a family, a clan, a county, a state, and yes, a nation. This psychic energy concerns us more than we have ever experienced. We remember what Margaret Atwood said about her 1985 novel, The Handmaid's Tale, a dystopian vision of America ruled by a totalitarian, patriarchal theocracy. I didn't put in anything that we haven't already done, we're not already doing, we're seriously trying to do, coupled with trends that are already in progress. It's not that we fear America becoming Gilead of Atwood's speculative fiction. We fear casual talk of civil war and actions that suggest that it is or could be an acceptable alternative to current discontents. We fear dissolution of the Union and all its ravages. Atwood described trends that are already in progress. We detect frightful trends in our politics and discourse. Balance must be struck between undue alarm and ignorant indifference. Alarmism can be dismissed as hysteria. Indifference is a license for inaction. We will initially view our current predicament through the lens of 3 Januaries. This will constitute the opening third of the book, the springboard for a deeper dive into election 2020, the slanders against it, the conspiracies that grew out of it, and remedies for the future. But we begin by taking stock of the month of January in 3 recent years and describe what was, what could have been, what is, and what might be. We start with a possible January 2023 when pressures arising from midterm election furies could push America towards civil war. We follow that with an alternate January 2017, a month we all remember. We explain what happened and then present an alternative history, a lengthy, messy fight to block President Trump's ascendancy to the presidency. We conclude with January 2022, where we catalog real events implicating and imperiling democracy, where no imagination is required to perceive bleak horizons for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Each of these Januaries is really about the events precipitated by another January, January 2021. Herewith, a cautionary tale about a possible and avoidable American unraveling, fiction amplified and informed by available facts. Part 1. 1. January 2023. America's second Civil War could start with a bang or with a whimper. It could begin with a skirmish or sneak up on us through a series of small compromises and acts of political cowardice. Civil war could announce itself loudly and bloodily, leaving no doubt as to its awful entrance. Or it could creep in through the back door, only to be recognized in hindsight as a series of seemingly disconnected events that could have and should have been stopped. We may be midstream in such a flow of events already. We now examine this possible future as if we have just emerged from its aftermath. During the 2022 campaign, National Democrats were bracing for a tidal wave that might eject them from control of the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, crippling President Biden's agenda and possibly accelerating former President Trump's formal announcement. He toyed with it throughout 2021 and 2022 as a candidate for the presidency in 2024. Democrats had long since lost patience with Republican accusations about the stolen 2020 election, which they came to believe led to a flurry of unnecessary and regressive laws in states dominated by Republican legislators. In Texas, a law passed that set new restrictions on mail-in ballot access, limited the use of drop boxes for early votes, and then went further by weaponizing and empowering hyper-partisan poll watchers to interfere with the voting process. This in a state where it was already harder to vote in than most other states. In states like Florida, Iowa, and Texas, professional election administrators found their efforts criminalized. In states like Arizona and Georgia, it appeared legislators were seizing control of elections by limiting the authority of election administrators at the state and county level, thereby creating the real possibility of partisan politicians rejecting the will of the voters. In several states, Arizona, Colorado, Georgia, Michigan, and Nevada, there were candidates running for Secretary of State on a platform of denying elections and delivering outcomes for their preferred candidates. All of this was very much on the minds of National Democrats. Many were seething. In such an environment, many were worried about armed poll watchers, inflamed passions, and even possible violence. In Texas, voters saw unusually long lines in voting precincts in urban areas like Houston, Austin, San Antonio, and Dallas, where recent legislation had resulted in concentrating more voting into a single day. The lines were longest in communities of color, thus confirming fears about the consequences of the new election law. Before the March 1, 2022 primary, voters in predominantly Democratic counties like Harris, Travis, and Bexar were seeing requests for mail-in ballots rejected at historically high rates, 15 times higher than Texas had previously experienced in their most populous counties. About this time, Democrats in Washington began wondering aloud if midterm election results could or should be believed. I think there's a real possibility that we will see in the next two elections get some results sent to us for ratification that's not consistent or that we're going to have to question. Texas Democratic Representative Colin Allred said, "That's the reality of the situation. We can no longer pretend like these elections are just going to continue to proceed the way they have in the past." At a press conference marking his administration's one-year anniversary, President Biden amplified this sentiment. When asked if the midterm elections would be legitimate, Biden said, "Well, it all depends on whether we are able to make the case to the American people that some of this is being set up to try to alter the outcome of this election." Biden's statements weren't as toxic as Trump's, but it deepened confusion and consternation, setting the country up for months of midterm election fear-mongering. Imagine a polling station in Texas on Election Day 2022. The location doesn't matter. Neither does the underlying dispute. What matters is a person came to the polls, purportedly on the hunt for voter fraud. States like Texas had given poll watchers more latitude to move around polling places, question procedures, and exercise authority. This person, in accordance with Texas law, was armed with a semi-automatic pistol. A discussion escalated into a confrontation, perhaps about the proper place to stand inside the polling precinct in relation to others, or about how to properly mark the ballot and use the ballot scanning machine. Tragically, things spun out of control. The person feared fraud was afoot and meant to stop it by any means necessary. It first came through a raised voice, then physical intervention, and ultimately through a brandished weapon. Tension and shouts ensued, followed by a scuffle. One shot rang out, and a poll worker lay bleeding on the floor of the gymnasium. The polling place was a high school. As the blood pooled, the victim passed away. Simultaneously, a friend of the victim hit send on a video taken of the conflict and its horrible aftermath. The video, as these things do, flew faster than news coverage and became a national sensation. Raw emotions frayed further. As Election Day played out in Texas, Democrats believed they were seeing some of their worst fears realized. The perception of long lines and disproportionate damage done to minority voters sparked genuine anguish and rage. Now a death, video confirmation of what Democrats came to see as senseless violence, marring and jeopardizing democracy. As for the polling place death, the causes and motives behind it were opaque. It might have been an unintentional escalation, not exactly an accident because there was a weapon and a confrontation, but certainly not premeditated. Every frame of the cell phone video was analyzed and then hyperanalyzed. It yielded no definitive answers to the discerning, and just enough to those quick to judge and blame. What the video did capture quite clearly was the grisly, harrowing aftermath. A life taken by a single bullet fired in a single precinct, in a single county, within a vast country, now unified by hatred, suspicion, and contempt. It seemed to be the only true unity this once great but now wayward nation appeared able to summon. The death video, as they say, went viral, but not benignly so. Quite fortunately, it did not lead to more violence. But in the hours after it appeared, more people began taking weapons to polling places. There were standoffs. There were fistfights. Police and sheriff's departments nationwide were deployed in almost SWAT-like fashion to protect poll workers, repel weekend vigilantes, and generally keep the peace. It was scary as hell up close, on cable, on cell phones, on Facebook, and myriad other apps. But it worked. An uneasy peace was erected and brittly maintained, though an atmosphere of foreboding and crisis pervaded. Or perhaps no such incident occurred. Maybe none was necessary to push the nation to the edge. In the months leading up to the November election, Trump and the circle of grifters that surrounded him continued to push and profit from the big lie. Trump's multifaceted yet groundless vilification of the 2020 election. Con artists continued to successfully push for incompetent investigations of the last election. Legislation based on the false pretext of election integrity, but which actually reduced it, was passed, and voter confidence suffered. Election deniers running for governor or Secretary of State or Congress won their primaries and amplified their platforms, or almost as dangerously, lost their primaries and doubled down on their divisive and destructive disinformation. Leading up to the November 2022 election, concerns about voter suppression and voter fraud were so amped up that whether either actually existed didn't matter anymore. When reports of long lines at polling places in Texas or Arizona or wherever came up, that alone was enough to light the fire. It could be a gunshot. It could be accumulated grievances. The combustibles are before us: voting, immigration, racism, abortion, crime. Things could move in dreadful directions, even if key players initially resist predictable grassroots pressure to lash out. We now describe events that could plausibly play out if either of the situations described before came to be. Whether it's nationally broadcast election bloodshed or a slow-boil confrontation over voter suppression in a state like Texas, it is not hard to imagine House Speaker Nancy Pelosi facing hard questions from her leadership team about Texas's entire delegation and other close House races. Texas could trigger a startling conversation about countermeasures. Democrats had already sued there over redistricting, alleging Republicans diluted minority voters by dispersing them in ways assuring more House seats in 2022. These gains were coming to be and were also emblematic of noxious trends. Republicans were on pace to win at least 25 Texas seats, many tainted, in the view of national Democrats, by violence, suppression, or both. With Texas at the center of these midterm aggravations, Democrats could feel it necessary, maybe even imperative, to use Texas as a pretext to prevent certification and recognition of the entire 38-member state delegation. This wouldn't be easy. Each term of the House is limited to 2 years. A new House majority would swear in members, and Republicans would hold sway. To cover their bets, House Democrats might also litigate all other close House races, generating lengthy delays and possibly widespread protests. Texas, as it turned out, was the fulcrum in the House of Representatives. Republicans, when all voters were counted, won nearly twice as many seats there as Democrats. That advantage would loom large in control of the House, but so would other races that turned out to be surprisingly close in states with new and more restrictive voting laws and in districts where suburban voter attitudes shifted over abortion and privacy-related politics. These close races gave Democrats ground to challenge results, slowing certification and sowing confusion while generating new partisan hostility. Under the Constitution, Congress is the judge of its own membership. There are limits, but Congress can, in theory and practice, refuse to seat or expel a member. As law professor Nicholas Stephanopoulos of Harvard University points out, the choice to seat or oust is a non-justiciable political question. No court can second-guess a chamber's judgment as to whether an election was free and fair or which candidate won a race. Congress has delayed or refused to seat a member whose victory has been certified. A dispute in 1984 over a House seat in Indiana, initially won by a Republican but awarded to a Democrat, convulsed the chamber for months. Slowing certification would gum up the process of creating a new House, even with an incoming GOP majority. An idea took hold. Refuse to seat the full Texas delegation and hold off recognition of disputed races in other states. This was not a novel idea, having been floated the previous year. Mark Elias, the prominent Democratic lawyer, had written in 2021 that as Republican legislatures enact new voter suppression laws, Congress should reaffirm the House's promise in 1965 to refuse to seat or to unseat members.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?